Hello, welcome to this iGCSE History Revision lecture by me, the History Revision Guide. This will be the first in a series of lectures I'm conducting on the CIE iGCSE History course, starting off with a three-part series looking at the first half of the iGCSE History course, with the focus on the interwar period, beginning with the first three key questions 1, 2, 3. And for this particular lecture, I'll be obviously starting off with key question 1, which looks at the extent to which the peace treaties of 1919 to 1923 were fair or not. So, just before we get started, a bit of background about this particular key question in terms of the background, in terms of the background context to events that are taking place. So, this first key question, or these first three key questions even rather, begin or are based around the attempt and ultimate failure by the major world powers to find a lasting peace settlement after the disaster that was the First World War. And so the war itself is obviously a devastating event, both in terms of the physical damage that it's responsible for, as well as the psychological impact it has on those who lived through it and survived to essentially tell the tale and witness events beyond it. And so the origins of that eventual failure to maintain world peace throughout this interwar period, despite the will to carry out that process, can arguably stem or be put at the door of the problematic attempts or peace settlement or attempts at a peace settlement that was agreed after the First World War at Versailles. And so this first key question is primarily concerned with the extent to which what the peace settlement was, how it came about, and also the extent to which it was a fair and in many ways quite rational settlement in terms of the future impact it would have in the years following it. And so before we actually begin by looking at the kind of main aspects of this topic, it's worth just beginning by considering the impact of the First World War on the various countries that took part in it. And whilst, of course, the war did have a somewhat negative effect on most countries involved, the war generally had a very uneven effect at the same time as well on the different countries that were involved in the war. So if we look at the four main countries, of course, that sort of bore the brunt of the fighting, and we start off with the Americans, who of course joined the war quite late, in sort of the latter half of the war, and only actually began to fight in the final year of the war, having taken over a year to mobilize after having declared war in the first place. So the United States, naturally having joined the war quite late, lose very few soldiers during the war, as well as suffering very little damage as well. And actually, when you look at many of sort of the losses they do suffer, as I say, away from the battlefield, the only real loss or damage the Americans have to sort of endure are sort of the loss to trade that takes place due to the German Navy attacking various different ships crossing the Atlantic in an attempt to basically disrupt transatlantic trade. So the Americans overall have very little in the way of lasting damage or impact from the First World War. Death toll is very low, and the broader sort of impact on the country and kind of the civilian infrastructure, etc., is fairly minimal outside of one or two high-profile incidents, for example, the sinking of the Lusitania. But then we start to turn to other countries, and when it comes to Britain, you start to see a country that suffers a little bit more during the war. However, Britain mainly suffers when it comes to death toll. Of course, Britain, alongside France, bear the brunt of the fight against the German forces. And so as a result, you get over 1 million soldiers being killed, and also close to 1 million casualties, over 1 million casualties and close to 1 million soldiers being killed overall throughout the course of the war, which is the first thing. So it obviously has quite a significant effect in terms of the soldiers themselves and their kind of wider families and people who know them. But then as well, the country is also left with a huge debt. And this is important. Economically, Britain does not do well as a result of the war. They have to borrow significant amounts of money to actually fund their war effort. And as a result, they come out of the war with quite significant debt they owe, and in addition to just general economic problems as well as a result. The war disrupts trade, and Britain, of course, is a trading or maritime power, and so trade is quite an important aspect of the core functioning of their economy. But then we turn to France, and France, of course, have the highest death toll of all the countries involved in the war, and that is both civilian and military. So on the first hand, obviously, again, like the British, they bear the brunt of the fighting, and so the war is very much a meat grinder for many of these French soldiers who are sent to the front lines to fight against the Germans. But also, the French, having had the war take part for the most part on their soil, also have to suffer significant civilian deaths, as well as extensive damage to their infrastructure. The French countryside is devastated as a result of the war, and this is something which will take a long time to recover from, as well as some sort of key towns and cities that also bore the brunt of some heavy fighting during the war as well. And so France really comes out of the war a shell of its former self and severely scarred from the experience of the war, both in terms of sort of psychological scarring, but also a strong desire to make sure that no war like that ever takes place again, and that France is secure in the future. And then, of course, we come to the defeated country, which is Germany. And you would think, of course, Germany, as the losing country, might have suffered some kind of extensive damage. However, what you find is that relative to their position, they don't actually suffer as much as the others. So the main problem Germany encounters during the war is the fact that the main Allied powers, in particular Britain, who had a naval blockade against them, were essentially cutting off the Germans cutting off their supply lines. And as a result, Germany was experiencing blockade. And so it became much more difficult as the war went on to bring in supplies into Germany, and that later on kind of begins to create issues in terms of starvation and hunger, etc., which eventually leads to their defeat in the war. However, the Germans themselves militarily aren't totally defeated. Now, from a strategic position, their outlook in the war deteriorates significantly in the final year, such that defeat is essentially inevitable. However, the Germans, in a very intelligent move, surrender pretty quickly once this position is quite clear, as the Kaiser abdicates and a civilian government decides to surrender to the Allied powers, hoping for a more lenient peace deal as a result. And so we find that the four countries, as I say, have a very different position coming out of the First World War. And this directly plays into how these countries, well, obviously the first three countries, go about attempting to negotiate a peace settlement that is imposed on the Germans after the First World War. So this takes us to the first major topic in Key Question 1, which is the aims and motives of the big three countries at Versailles. And so the Treaty of Versailles is one of 5 treaties that are negotiated and agreed upon after the war to basically impose upon the defeated countries. So each of the defeated countries have their own individual treaty imposed upon them, and the one that is imposed on Germany is, of course, the Treaty of Versailles. And so, despite there being dozens of delegates being present at these negotiations, and despite there being actually many other sort of major or semi-important powers, for example, Italy, the focus is usually on the big three powers who do, in the end, massively influence those negotiations, and as a result are the ones who essentially construct the post-war settlement. And these three are, first of all, Lloyd George, who is of course the Prime Minister in Britain, Clemenceau, who is the French Prime Minister, and Woodrow Wilson, who is the US President. And these three people are all quite different individuals in terms of their motivations and aims, and in terms of what they want out of a peace settlement at Versailles. So starting off with Clemenceau, who often gets the sort of bad rap in terms of his attitude towards the Germans during the negotiations. So Clemenceau, like the French public, demanded revenge against Germany, and he also, as a result, wants terms that will guarantee the future security of France. So as we already saw, France is devastated by the war, and so as a starting point, given the high death toll, they want revenge on Germany as a starting point. But actually, when you really look at the terms they begin to demand, what's quite clear is that whilst revenge is on the agenda, what is much more important in terms of what the French want is actually a sense of security, and an idea that actually in the future, France can guarantee that it will not be attacked by its much larger neighbour on its border, Germany. And so when we look at the terms that the French initially tried to demand, they're very much in line and consistent with these sort of motives, with these motives. So first of all, the French want the German army to be completely dismantled. And so again, bearing in mind that after the First World War, Germany, despite having lost to France on the one hand, is actually in a militarily stronger position than the French were, because the French have actually suffered these significant losses, but the Germans surrender before before their army can be totally wiped out. And so they still retain a significant fighting force. Beyond that, of course, the French also want to punish the Germans by crippling their economy. So they want to impose massive reparations that will cripple the German economy. And so on the one hand, again, this is a desire to essentially have revenge and also weaken Germany in the future. But also, this is so that France can receive reparations that will help them pay off their debts that they, like Britain, have accumulated as a result of the First World War, mainly in relation to the US. They also then again, consistent with this desire for security, they want the Rhineland, which is the border territory between France and Germany, to be an independent state. And so from the French perspective, this essentially creates a buffer zone or a buffer country protecting them from Germany. So the Germans cannot simply cross over their border into France to attack them if they have that desire in the future. And then lastly, of course, in terms of key aims, there are some other smaller aims as well. They wish to regain Alsace-Lorraine, which is a former French territory that was lost to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, and so it had essentially been taken over by the Germans, but was originally French territory. They wish to receive the Saar industrial area, which is a key, again, border area, but more importantly, has a few of the important industrial areas of Germany. So the idea is, again, it will help the French extract some important resources to help with their own recovery after the war. And then, of course, finally, they next, of course, want a share of the German colony. So Germany formerly has an empire, and the French, as the winners, think to themselves, actually, it's only fair if we can take some of those territories for ourselves, as essentially spoils of war. And then finally, the French think maybe they could potentially break up Germany altogether. We then come on to the British, who have much more complex aims. And so the difference, first of all, here is, unlike France, which has fairly united aims, the British, there is a divide between what the public wants and what Lloyd George wants, the Prime Minister. And so the publicly Lloyd George pledges to squeeze the Germans until the pip squeaks, or to squeeze the Germans until the pip squeaks. And this is essentially in line with their public's demand for revenge. The British public, having seen the damage of the war, and also due to the quite heightened propaganda efforts by the government itself against Germany, they are quite convinced they want real revenge, and they want Germany to be punished severely for their role in the war. However, in private, Lloyd George is much more pragmatic, and actually he wants to seek a middle ground solution because he essentially has two concerns. He, first of all, whilst he wants to see Germany punished, he wants to see at the same time Germany be able to rebuild in the future and recover so that Britain may trade with them in the future, as well as another enduring fear, which is that Lloyd George and the British more generally are terrified of the increasing threat of communism spreading from the East. And so just a year earlier, or 2 years earlier rather, a communist revolution has taken place in Russia and overthrown the British allies there. And so that ends up being, alongside the wish for a trading ally in Germany, a quite important and predominant factor in deciding how the British want to approach the Germans in negotiations. And so we see terms that are similar to France, but much more moderated in nature. So they first of all wish to agree alongside the French with dividing up German colonies, but at the same time, they don't want to break up Germany as a state. So the actual colonies Germany has in the empire can be divided between Britain and France rather. But in terms of breaking up Germany as a state, the British really have no time for this as a demand. They then, of course, want to see reasonable reparations that Germany will have to pay to help sort of pay off war damages and help rebuild their various neighbouring countries. However, again, at the same time, they do not wish to see reparations set so high that the German economy is as a result crippled, and as I said beforehand, crucially leads to poverty, and poverty is seen as something which can often lead to communist revolutions stirring up. And so the British are really concerned to make sure that Germany is not so badly damaged in terms of their economy that communist revolution begins to be threatened as a result. And then finally, again, the British wish to see an army reduction, but at the same time, they do not want to see a complete destruction of the army. But in a very sneaky fashion, the British do wish to see significant reductions in the size of the German navy, because of course the navy is Britain's main source of military power, and that would ensure that the Germans could not once again threaten Britain again. So there is also some degree of self-interest in terms of how the British are responding here or wishing to deal with the Germans. And then, of course, that leads us finally to Woodrow Wilson, who's the final major player involved in negotiations at Versailles. So Woodrow Wilson as a personality is of course often seen as this idealistic leader, the good man from the New World who sort of comes over to Europe hoping to sort of preach his gospel to them essentially. And so he wants to create a new world order based upon these ideas of his. He creates known as the 14 points, each of which are essentially points designed to help ensure world peace in the future. And so Woodrow Wilson is this idealist with a clear plan of action for how he wants to deal with Europe. However, the US public are not as interested in global affairs as Wilson is, and they themselves wish to remain isolationist, or they wish to remain in isolation from the rest of the world and demand isolationism as a policy, which later, of course, comes back to bite Woodrow Wilson, as you'll see in the next topic when we look at the League of Nations. And so, in terms of his aims, the first major aim he has as part of his 14 points is the creation of a League of Nations to maintain world peace. That's essentially a negotiating body that would help to maintain peace between countries and deal with conflict resolution in a more civilized fashion. The next main aim he has is that all countries should disarm. This is part of his 14 points. And that actually it isn't just the defeated countries like Germany that should be disarming, dismantling their armies, but actually it should even be the victors, because he views the arms race before the war as having been a key cause of the First World War in the first place. So then his next aim, again, part of his 14 points, is he strongly believes in something known as self-determination. In other words, this idea that countries should have the right to determine their own future, who they should be a part of, if they should have independence, etc. And this should be carried out via a process known as having a plebiscite. In other words, it's a vote, like a referendum. It's the technical term for referendum in the, at that point in time. And so he wants self-determination. He then, though, again, in link to that idea of self-determination, he does not like the idea that Britain and France get to essentially, as victors, confiscate German colonies for themselves and help to expand and enlarge their own empires. Wilson himself is quite skeptical and is quite, I suppose you could say, unimpressed by the idea of empire. And so he doesn't want them to go to those countries. He instead wants these countries to go to the League of Nations for them to eventually, in the future, become governed as independent states. And then finally, quite similar to Lloyd George, he wishes to see reparations paid, but again, not a crippling amount that would long-term damage or destroy the German economy. And so, looking at the actual terms of the treaty, the terms of the treaty end up becoming a compromise between the three major players, with some individuals getting more out of it than they wanted, whereas others would have been a little bit more disappointed. So, starting off with the territorial terms of the treaty. So in terms of the territory, the colonial empire of Germany is first of all divided up amongst the winners. Germany also loses Alsace-Lorraine as a territory to France, as of course Clemenceau was asking for. And of course Alsace-Lorraine previously had, or rather Alsace-Lorraine controlled 75% of Germany's iron resource, so a key strategic resource. The Saar, which is another kind of region of Germany that's a key industrial area, was handed over to the League of Nations for 15 years, so not given to France, as they were demanding. France, though, however, is allowed to run the coal mines for 15 years, and in other words, extract the benefits of that region for their own, for themselves. A couple of other kind of semi-important territories. So a very controversial one later on is that West Prussia is given to Poland, and so what happens is Poland essentially gets given access to the sea, what is known as the so-called Polish corridor, and it splits Germany in two as a country. So when you look at the border of Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, there is a part of there's a part of Germany in the east that is essentially surrounded by Poland, because this has essentially been cut off from Germany when they gave the Polish corridor, if you look at a map, which I don't have right now, to Poland. We then, of course, have reparations. And so you might, from your sort of knowledge, have remembered that reparations are eventually set at £6.6 billion to be paid. However, at Versailles itself, they don't actually set this sum at Versailles. At Versailles, the Germans are forced to sign a blank check. In other words, they will pay whatever they are forced to pay, but it will be decided at a later date. And so in 1921, this reparation payment is eventually settled at or agreed upon as the 6.6 billion number, which you're of course aware of. We then go to the restrictions made to Germany's army. Again, quite a famous set of restrictions. So Germany's army is not destroyed in the same way that Clemenceau wanted, but at the same time it is significantly reduced and made a lot weaker. So the army itself, in terms of the land forces, are reduced or limited to 100,000 men only. As a follow-up, they also banned conscription, which means they cannot essentially force soldiers to join the army. They also ban the maintaining of armored vehicles, aka tanks and submarines. They also limit the navy to 6 battleships or warships. The air force has to be completely dismantled. And then finally, and quite importantly, the territory known as the Rhineland, which of course we mentioned beforehand, which is what France wanted as an independent state, instead remains as part of Germany, but it becomes demilitarized. In other words, no soldiers of the German army are allowed to step foot in the Rhineland, and the Germans cannot build any fortifications in the Rhineland either. And so the Rhineland is quite important as a sort of territory, because the Rhine itself is a river. And so for the Germans, it acts as a natural barrier, or a natural defensive barrier against the French. So in other words, it kind of sort of leaves the Germans vulnerable to the French if they cannot put their troops in the Rhineland. And so it essentially dissuades the Germans from attempting anything sort of untoward in the event that it might lead to the French taking action against them. And then finally, well, actually not finally, second to last, there is of course the War Guilt Clause. And so under Article 231 of the League of Nations, known as the War Guilt Clause, Germany was said to have, or was held wholly to blame for the outbreak of the First World War, which in and of itself doesn't lead to any individual actions, but essentially acts as a moral justification for the nature of the treaty, as of course the war was Germany's fault entirely, according to the treaty. Finally, there's the League of Nations. And so the countries do agree to form a League of Nations fairly early on. It's not a particularly controversial point, despite their different views over what it should look like. And so a League of Nations is created that would settle international disputes in a civilized fashion. Crucially though, as a follow-up term, Germany is forbidden from joining the League of Nations until it proved to be a peaceful country. So the first big question you can get, whether it's a 6-mark question or a sort of individual 10-mark questions, is you can get questions that ask you why individual countries were not satisfied with what they received at Versailles, or the extent to which countries were satisfied or not. And so France as a country were largely happy with the treaty. They didn't get everything they wanted, but for the most part, the terms that were agreed were designed to give France what they wanted, aka security and some degree of revenge, though the revenge aspect of it wasn't so prominent in the treaty itself. So first of all, the treaty satisfies a number of Clemenceau's specific demands. In particular, the demand that he wanted the reclaiming of Alsace-Lorraine. That did go back to France in the end, which is exactly what he was asking for. And then secondly, they did of course get a share of Germany's colonies. And so again, it was a very specific demand which they received. They were, of course, despite not having the exact nature of the exact crippling reparations they were demanding, as it was set as a blank check, the French were likely, of course, to be the biggest recipient of those eventual German reparations. And so again, that was set, that was agreed in the negotiations, and the French were, of course, as a result, fairly pleased with that result. The French were also relatively secure on their eastern border with Germany for 2 reasons. First of all, due to the arms reductions. Again, it wasn't quite what they were asking for, but again, it left the French fairly secure. And lastly, of course, they were given, or rather there was the demilitarization of the Rhineland, which, as I said in the previous slide, meant the French were in a far more secure position, as the Germans were more vulnerable towards the French in the event of war breaking out. And then, of course, there was the loss of land. There was sort of the resources that sort of reduced Germany. There was sort of the loss of land meant that there was a loss of resources, and that as a result reduced Germany's economic and military capacity, again in line with France's overall wishes, even if not to the extreme degree the French were initially wishing for. However, as a counter, if you were to argue that actually the French were not wholly satisfied with their outcomes of Versailles, the French did still to a degree feel vulnerable. And this is because the French had tried, as a sort of a compromise with some of the slightly more lenient terms, they had tried to convince the Americans and the British to agree to a treaty that would essentially assist France in the face of future German aggression. And so after the treaty, after the negotiations are over, this is initially agreed to. However, the American public is very much against this, and so the Americans do not ratify this agreement or end up following up with this agreement. And then when the Americans fall off, the British are unwilling to, if they're not unwilling, without the Americans, to also enforce this agreement. And so the French are left without a guarantee, and so they still feel vulnerable to a degree, but they are largely pleased and happy with the result. The US have very mixed feelings about the peace settlement overall, and actually of the three countries, arguably get the least out of it. And so the one thing they do get out of it, what they're particularly pleased about, of course, is the creation of a League of Nations. That is essentially based upon the principles that were set out by the US, and those principles were essentially accepted. And so on this front, the Americans, or rather the Americans are fairly pleased, or Wilson is pleased. They are also pleased, like the British, that the treaty is not unfairly harsh on Germany, and that actually it would remain a reasonable power as opposed to being fully crippled as the French were initially hoping for. They're also pleased to see some of the self-determination that was achieved as a result of the negotiations, so that you get, after the Treaty of Versailles, the creation of some independent states. So Poland is newly independent, as well as the creation of some brand new states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So some of the people living in these areas are basically, as a result, given self-determination. However, they are not pleased at all by the behaviour of the British and the French, who clearly rewarded themselves for their victory in the war by essentially helping themselves to Germany's colonies. Now, technically, those colonies are given to the League of Nations as mandates, but the League of Nations then gives those colonies to Britain and France to govern in their name. And so they are essentially colonies in all but name. And this, of course, does not please the US, who wanted these countries to become independent eventually. And then, of course, they're unhappy about the exceptions to self-determination, such as the Austrians, who, of course, are Germans, but are forbidden from uniting with Germany due to the terms of the treaty. And then, of course, the Sudeten Germans, who live in Czechoslovakia, who, again, are not given the right to self-determination and are left trapped living in Czechoslovakia under the rule of the Czechs. Finally, of course, they are not happy that the only countries forced to disarm were, of course, the defeated countries. In particular Germany. And so that wasn't quite what they wanted. They were hoping for each major country to disarm, because that was seen to be an initial cause of the First World War. And so the Americans are arguably the least pleased of all the big three. The most pleased, though, obviously given they actually wanted a compromise in the first place, naturally it was going to be along their lines. The British, of course, got most of what they wanted and were really satisfied with most of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And so, on the whole, if you consider the terms of the treaty, Lloyd George basically gets his way of having or establishing a moderate peace that allows the European economy to recover. He also crucially successfully manages to temper the demands of Clemenceau. The punishments that are in the end imposed upon Germany end up resembling, again, those compromise proposals that Lloyd George was suggesting. So some reparations, but not crippling. Some reduction in armaments, but again, not completely destroying the German army. They, of course, also managed to serve their own interests through the expansion of their colonies in their colonial empire. And of course, the British Empire ends up reaching its most significant, or its largest expanse or extent after the end of the First World War, having gained a lot of the former colonies and territories of both Germany, but also other defeated countries such as Turkey. And finally, of course, another very cheeky addition to the Treaty of Versailles, designed to serve the British, were the naval restrictions placed upon Germany. These, of course, were designed to bolster the already strong position of Britain on the seas, as it essentially took out Britain's only major naval rival. And so this, again, was a result which the British were pleased with. And so on the whole, the Treaty of Versailles ends up resembling many of Britain's key aims and interests at the kind of outset of negotiations. So we then come to the German opinion about the treaty. So naturally, Germany felt the treaty was very harsh and objected to the treaty as a result. So there's kind of a few main reasons why that was the case. So German leaders surrendered, first of all, surrendered to the Allied powers at the time they did without carrying on the fight, because they believed it would earn them a lighter treaty. In their perspective, it was the Kaiser who begun the war. They took over after he went into exile, and within about a month surrendered to the Allied powers and were negotiating throughout that entire month. And so they felt betrayed. Within the actual terms itself, it felt like some of them were particularly harsh. So it felt like it was a double punishment for Germany to have to A, pay reparations, but B, at the same time, lose their vital resources that would actually enable them to make those reparation payments in the first place. So it seems like double whammy when it comes to reparations. They also argued that the treaty was a diktat, or in other words, a dictated peace, as they were essentially excluded from negotiations. And so when the Germans were invited to Versailles, it was not as negotiators, they simply had no choice but to accept. They were able to kind of put in some criticisms of the eventual terms, but this really had no impact whatsoever. And so the actual or the eventual terms of the treaty are seen as a diktat. And lastly, of course, they felt that the war guilt clause, which we mentioned beforehand, was a very unfair term, as first of all, it was seen as an unfair justification for the harshness of the treaty, but in addition, there was the fact that the war itself was not really all Germany's fault from their own perspective, and so again, it was seen as a very unfair and untrue term of the treaty. So the Germans are naturally very unhappy at the Treaty of Versailles. But then things get worse for Germany. There is arguably quite a significant political and economic impact of the treaty. Now, some of these are arguably exaggerated, in particular economic impact, and there is some dispute and discussion of the extent to which this was due to the treaty, or whether the Germans were arguably actually manufacturing crises to try and secure a renegotiation of their terms. However, we can generally argue there are three main impacts, or key impacts rather, or significant impacts of the Treaty of Versailles in Germany. So first of all, you have political violence breaking out. So the treaty helps to create political instability in at least two high-profile attempts by right-wing extremists to try to overthrow the government. So you have first of all the Kapp Putsch, which takes place in 1920, which is led by a series of ex-military soldiers, also ex-soldiers who are essentially let go from the army, who attempt to overthrow the government. And then of course there's also the famous Munich Putsch 3 years later, led by Hitler himself, which again almost comes close to succeeding. And then, of course, aside from that, there are also a series of political assassinations of key government figures throughout this time period. So you have significant political instability. Now, this can be seen to be as a result of the Treaty of Versailles for a couple of reasons. First of all, the treaty helped to create violence because it created resentment among the public, who saw the treaty as essentially a betrayal, and it created resentment especially among nationalists and also made the government unpopular. And so it bolsters or leads to a number of attempts against the government. But then not only does it create attempts against the government, the Treaty of Versailles, in weakening Germany's armed forces, it left them more vulnerable to those same crises, and it made it much more difficult for the Germans to deal with political violence as a result. And so the Treaty of Versailles does help to create political violence and political turmoil within Germany. You then, of course, then get the first major political crisis or broader crisis which takes place as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, arguably, and that is the Ruhr Crisis of 1923. And this first major crisis comes about after the failure by the Germans to pay the second installment of reparations in 1922. So reparations are initially agreed in 1921. The Germans pay their first payment of, I think £50 million without any issues. But then a year later, they decide and try to argue they cannot actually pay and try to negotiate some kind of relaxation of terms. The French decide this is nonsense and believe they will not believe the Germans, and they lose patience gradually as the Germans continue to kind of bide for time and refuse to pay up. And so French and Belgian soldiers cross into the Ruhr in 1923 to take those reparations in the form of raw materials and goods by force. The German government, in response, then orders the workers in the Ruhr to go on strike so that no goods can be produced as a result and that the French will not be getting their payments as a result. The French respond quite harshly to this, not impressed at all by this attempt by the Germans, as under the Treaty of Versailles it was legal for the French to go into Germany and take goods by force if necessary. And so the French army responds harshly, in the end killing 100 workers during the course of this strike. And so eventually production in the Ruhr is shut down as a result of this Ruhr crisis. So you have the first major impact of the Treaty of Versailles in terms of a specific event in the Ruhr crisis. The Ruhr crisis, however, has an offshoot in terms of the economic crisis that it therefore creates. This is because the German government is forced to pay the workers who it's convinced to go on strike in the first place, but to do this they're having to basically print money. Printing money, however, as a process is something which creates hyperinflation. In other words, the massive, this sort of very rapid and extreme inflation that takes place in a country, whereby a country's currency ends up becoming virtually worthless. And this is exactly what happens in Germany. The value of money within the space of 1 year becomes completely, utterly worthless. And this ends up being, or this is rather, a complete disaster for many Germans. both in terms of sort of pensioners who of course have been saving up money over the course of their lives, or also middle class families who again have savings. Now these savings, when hyperinflation takes place, become completely worthless. The only people who really benefit from hyperinflation in this situation in particular are of course these big industrialists or sort of business owners who use this situation to pay off whatever large debts they might have had in the first place. And so the hyperinflation crisis leaves a very bitter memory within German society, and due to this very terrible impact, and this kind of carries on long after the economy has recovered, long after the German economy has recovered. And so this takes us to our final couple of points, and this is the final area of this key question, which is the extent to which the Treaty of Versailles was fair or not on Germany. So in terms of arguments you can make here, and this is the main overall question you can get, and it can often come in the form of a 10-mark question, and it's typically the most common 10-mark question you could be asked about. And so there are a few different arguments you can make here. And what you want to try to do is as well, when you use some of these arguments, it's ideal for you to link it to a specific term of the treaty which is supposedly unfair as a result, or is supposedly fair. So as a starting point, there is the argument that Germany was the most aggressive country during the First World War. They were the ones who had essentially made most offensive moves. They're the ones who essentially got into countries and kind of introduced poison gas and essentially destroyed villages, etc., and seem to have behaved sort of the most brutally in terms of the conduct of the war. And so, as a result, it's only fair that Germany's army, navy, and air force be targeted due to their conduct in the war. As a follow-up, of course, as well linked to that, it is of course seen as Germany who begun the war in the first place. Germany were the ones who gave Austria a blank check to invade Austria. This is following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Germany is seen to have enabled the beginning of the war because they essentially gave the Austrians a blank check, where essentially the point there being was they would back up the Austrians in any course of action they took, even if that included waging war in Serbia. And so this is seen to have triggered the First World War, as well as, again, their very aggressive movements they made, such as the commencing of the Schlieffen Plan, which essentially invaded neutral Belgium quite aggressively and quite unfairly. And so it is fair as a result to say that Germany deserves war guilt, because it was Germany which began the war, and Germany who carried out the Schlieffen Plan. And then in terms of the other sort of terms of the Treaty of Versailles, for example, the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France, this is seen to be a particularly fair term of the treaty, as Alsace-Lorraine as a territory was traditionally part of France, but had been annexed by Germany after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, that of course ended in Germany's favour. And so this is simply the returning of an old French territory to its rightful owner. And finally, and in many ways the best argument that the Treaty of Versailles was fair, and I would always recommend you make this point if a question like this comes up, because it's a very rich and very well put point you can make. And this is that Germany would have enforced a similarly harsh treaty on the Allies. And the evidence for this is the fact that in March 1918, Germany forced an exceptionally harsh treaty on the Russians, who had surrendered following the Bolshevik Revolution and wanted to leave the war. And so this treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, essentially imposed very harsh reparations on Russia and also confiscated large parts of their land. And so as a result, we can say that the kind of harsh reparations that were agreed upon eventually, as well as these land confiscation, was fairly consistent with what Germany did to Russia after they forced them to sign a treaty. And so from that point of view, the treaty is of course fair, as it's the same treatment Germany gave Russia. But then to finish off, there are, of course, some quite strong arguments that the Treaty of Versailles was, in fact, a harsh treaty. And so the first argument is that, again, going back to war guilt, now whilst Germany does bear some guilt for the war, it's definitely unfair to argue that Germany bears all the guilt for having caused the war, because actually it wasn't simply Germany who caused the war. It was first of all the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that sparked the war in the first place, and that of course nothing to do with Germany. But then of course there were also the sort of secret diplomacy that took place in the First World War, the arms race, etc. So the argument that it was Germany who caused the war solely is historically inaccurate, to say the least. And so in that sense, this term of the treaty is not fair. And actually, as the war guilt clause is used to justify the harshness of other terms, in many ways this really does undermine the extent to which you can argue the Treaty of Versailles was fair. The second point is that if you look at the terms of the treaty, there is an argument that some of the terms of the treaty specifically punish German citizens and civilians, who of course were not the ones who waged the war, and view the mistakes of the war as not having been theirs. It was actually the mistakes of the German government, who was who was sort of dominated by warmongers, who took the decision to enter war in August 1914, and it was the government who declared war, not the people. And so you can argue that certain terms like reparation payments, for example, end up having a significant impact on the public, in particular when it creates crises like the hyperinflation crisis that lead to so many people, ordinary people, going bankrupt and losing their livelihoods. And so you can argue here that the treaty unfairly punished ordinary Germans, whereas it should have punished the German government who had actually gone to war in the first place. There's then the argument that if you actually look at the terms of the treaty itself, the terms of the treaty clearly don't have as much to do with creating a fair treaty as much as it has something to do with sort of rewarding the Allied powers as a result, sort of for their kind of victory in the First World War. So if we look at the terms of the treaties, they're clearly designed to serve the personal interest of particular countries. So Britain, for example, clearly was only out for their own personal interest, and this is no more obvious or clear than when you consider the way in which they pushed for and achieved restrictions to the German Navy. Restrictions to the German Navy were simply designed to ensure that Germany could not compete in the future with Britain's Navy instead. As it's clearly a very self-interested term, and there are a few others like that dotted around throughout the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, as well as, for example, the demand of confiscating Germany's colonies. Finally, of course, a point which I've already been over in relation to the political crises is the unfair or seemingly unfair restrictions on the German army. And so the argument is that in restricting Germany's army to such a small number of essentially only 100,000 volunteers, the treaty left Germany defenseless and vulnerable. And so this first of all left Germany potentially defenseless against outside sort of foreign aggressive countries, but more importantly, as I've already mentioned, this arguably led to further turmoil and political crises breaking out in Germany after the war due to the German government's inability to effectively clamp down on aggressive sort of right-wing extremist groups. And so as a result, the Treaty of Versailles here can be seen to have directly led to the sort of political crisis that break out in Germany. And so once again, it could be argued that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair. And that's the final point I'll make in relation to that topic. And so as a final kind of overall point before I finish, as you can see, the Treaty of Versailles tends to be a not particularly long topic. The vast majority of questions you can be asked will generally revolve around the following issues that I've been over. The one issue that I've not covered, and I'll essentially leave for you to do yourself, is you can sometimes get, and this has become increasingly common in recent years, you can have questions come up in exams that ask you about the other four treaties of the sort of Paris Peace Conferences. So what you want to do for those is essentially just know a few of the basic details of terms of those treaties, because you can be asked 4-mark questions about them. But then the final question you can also receive, which is more tricky, is you can be asked a question about why the Treaty of Sèvres, which was the treaty imposed upon Turkey, was eventually renegotiated and turned into the Treaty of Lausanne. And so this is the final set of questions you can get that can be particularly tricky as well if you've not prepared for them. So have a go at looking at those yourself and sort of outside of this as well, just in case you do, as has become quite common in recent years, get a question looking at those particular topics. So overall, I hope you found that was a very useful lecture overall. Any questions you have or issues that I wasn't particularly clear about or issues you want clarified, if you sort of leave any questions in the comments section below, and I will try to answer them as soon as I can and to the best of my ability as well. Thank you for listening.